Hi, welcome to Miss Richardson's U.S. History 5-Minute Lectures. This information will be U.S. Notes 2.13, the Dust Bowl. It includes information that aligns with the third section of your study guide on Unit 2. Now remember, you have control of this lecture, so pause whenever you need to, rewind if you have to, write things down, and use your study guide to help you study and take notes. Let's go ahead and get started. So you've heard now about how the Great Depression impacted everyday life for Americans. Now, while life in the Great Depression was awful for almost every American, it was even more difficult for farmers. As I mentioned previously, in the 1920s, farming was already the only industry that was not doing well. Farmers were already struggling, and it just got worse and worse in the 1930s. So farmers were already competing with technology and had lost a lot of money throughout the 1920s. As bigger farms were created by businesses, prices dropped for food. This forced many of the farmers to sell land or to not make enough money to continue to plant their entire fields. So when prices dropped in the 20s, a lot of farmland actually started going unused because the farmers couldn't afford to plant it anymore. So that meant no plants, wheat, or even grass existed in these fields. They were completely bare. Then in 1932, there was a major drought in the country. With no plants in the soil literally just became dust. It literally blew away. You can see in the picture, that's just dust blowing. And the picture on the left is the dust that built up to the windows, literally feet deep. This became known as the Dust Bowl. So these farming areas of the U.S. became the Dust Bowl. It led to horrible dust storms that would actually choke the few remaining crops and families. The storms would blow through the South and Midwest, cover everything in layers of dust that were feet, not inches, but feet deep. The picture in the center is actually a car buried in the dust. You can see how deep it is and what it did. Crops that actually had been planted were killed, and people actually would breathe in the dust and get sick, lung diseases and things like that. So most farmers at this point, they lost all their crops, they could not pay their farm mortgages, and they lost their homes. They and their families were forced to leave, and everyone was hearing that there were jobs in the West, there were jobs in California, so the farmers tended to head west searching for jobs. Some went to cities and competed with the workers there for the very few factory jobs that were left. So all these newly displaced farmers were called Okies. Okies was a derogatory term or a mean name to call people. So many of the Okies were from Oklahoma, which is where the term came from, but others were from all across the South and Midwestern farming region, so they weren't just from Oklahoma. These displaced families joined thousands of other Americans in Hoovervilles and roadside camps. They were trying to find work anywhere in the U.S. Towns and communities throughout the West, where many of the displaced farmers and others traveled in search of jobs, were really unwelcoming. They couldn't care for their own citizens, let alone the thousands of homeless who now pass through every single month. So unhappiness and hopelessness increased. Americans wondered if their lives would ever improve. And as problems continued to pile on, more and more Americans blamed Hoover for failing to stop the Great Depression and to help them in their time of need. So this is the end of U.S. Notes 2.13. I hope you learned something, and if you have any questions, make sure you bring them to class.